And this idea, this very Eurocentric colonial idea that comes up all the time, is that to be devoid of obligation, to be devoid of responsibility, is freedom.
Mm.
But that's really just alienation.
Yin, it is great to have you back at Tree Elbow and to share some food and a men's circle last night together.
Mm.
Us, yeah, we haven't seen each other for a while. And I wanted to have a yarn with you, a public yarn again. And this morning over pancakes, we talked about different subjects. And the one that seemed alive to us both was men's business and rites of passage and maybe fatherhood and even elderhood in there. And I thought maybe a good place to start would be to both share a little of what our teenage rites of passage moment was. Like, where were you? What happened? What were some of the big journey? What are some of the big things that happened in that journey from boy to manhood for you?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, as a teenager, for me, I was very shy as a child, and as a teenager, I was very shy and introverted and kind of socially awkward. So I guess for me, learning how to kind of be comfortable, yeah, in social situations was pretty hard. That was a rites of passage that were not really a short-term thing, more of a long-term thing. That was hard to deal with. Another interesting moment really was of kind of challenge, I guess, was so relationships were challenging for me, I'd say, at that stage. But also when I started working full time in an office job. It was only full time on the university holidays. This is when I was an older teenager. But it was a bit of a shock, actually, that whole business of work. You know, what is work, and what is this business of hanging out for 8 hours a day, sitting at a desk? That felt very shocking to my system, actually. Took some getting used to, and it was a kind of a rites of passage into the modernity's standard operating procedures when it comes to work, office work. And part of that actually maybe is one of the reasons why I decided to create my own rites of passage experience by volunteering to join the Australian Army Reserves.
This is in Darwin?
Yeah, in Darwin, yeah. And do the boot camp training. So that was a kind of a good juxtaposition to the grueling task of sitting behind a desk for 8 hours a day. Yeah, a good opposing experience.
Do you remember the call? What that was? Like what? Knowing nothing about that, unless you had a family member or a friend in it already. But like, what was the pull into that space?
No, I didn't know anything about it. It was the pull was something about wanting to be challenged to kind of that challenge of exertion and arduousness of difficult conditions and kind of solid structure, strong holding of space by, the corporals and the sergeants and the officers who were running these things. And so it was I wanted to be pushed to limits, and it seemed like a good way to do that.
Mm. That's a pretty masculine space. Um, and the call, what I'm hearing is that masculine structure. What did you discover in that about yourself, but also about institutional masculine environment?
Yeah, I discovered that it's good to be challenged physically and
Mm.
to combine hard kind of long nights, little sleep, long marches with learning some stuff about, navigation, for example. So learning skills at the same time. And what it's like to be pushed to my limits was something I learned, and that I wasn't too bad at it, and I was up for the challenge. So it was a good
Mm.
learning. Um,
Did it build confidence at
yes,
that
it built
stage?
confidence. Yeah,
Yeah.
in something broader than just intellectual pursuits, which I knew I was good at already, and the office job did, connect with that
Mm.
intellectual left brain sort of stuff. This was more body embodied. I wouldn't say it was right brain, but it was embodied
Mm.
activities. And
Mm.
yeah, I wasn't a huge fan of the hyper masculine kind of patriarchal culture that was the army. So I only stayed in the army for a few years doing reserve stuff. But the courses I found that we did other courses other than the boot camp
Mm.
were good. Were good challenges, yeah, for me to become more comfortable in my body, pushing bodies to limits, and these sort of things are as a balance to the heady intellectual sort of work that I was doing at university and in the office during the university breaks.
Mm. So you're a late teenager. In your teenage years, um, I mean, my teenage years were fairly hectic, chaotic, middle child, insecurities, um, a good older brother who took on the household values very strongly and um, became a school prefect, and then an adored younger sister. Um, and I was the rat bag in the middle of it. And I found my way of relating as a rat bag. And so, therefore, drugs and alcohol and stealing out at night and getting up to, um, just I think the seeking was of independence, was breaking the family patrimony and matrimony that my parents had created. That strong Christian valued, um, very secure and loving space. And I needed to tear that down for some reason.
Mm.
Was there chaos in those years for you?
I was the older oldest child. I had a younger brother, and so I was more of the responsible, sensible type of.
Mm.
I was socially awkward, so
Yeah.
I ended up. I wasn't really much trouble, no, but I ended up hanging out a lot with my brother's friends and that social circle, and
Mm.
was always, the designated driver. Didn't drink
Mm.
alcohol, and so I was pretty. pretty straight and down the line, and I did. It's quite anti-authoritarian though from an early age, so I kind of had a mixture of doing my own thing, not really causing trouble as such, but not really very good at necessarily following the rules.
Yeah.
I did spend a fair number of lessons when I was meant to be at school down the road at the local games. What do you call those in those days with all the arcade games?
Yeah, arcade parlour.
Arcade parlour, yeah. So I wagged school a fair bit and wasn't really like a proper nerd. I wasn't welcome in the proper nerd group. I didn't have a group at school that I was welcome in, so we had to find our own found our own misfit group for people who didn't have a place to be in other groups.
Nice. And you have Rakaya heritage from up in the Gulf country. At that stage of your life as a young man, did you know much about the culture or have since learned about rites of passage in that community? Is there anything you are able to share from that side of your ancestry? And
Yeah, I didn't know much. I wasn't connected much. My grandmother, so through my maternal line is my Aboriginal heritage, and my grandmother was stolen generation, so there was a big kind of rent and wound in the family in terms of cultural continuity. And yeah, still to this day, we don't connect much with the specific practices of our ancestral groups. Yeah, my interest in indigenous knowledges has grown a lot since I was a teenager, and I'm learning a lot, but it's quite it's still fairly general. It's not specific to Wakaya practices. No, it's some of the culture still remains, of course, in part up there in the Gulf country, but it's very heavily impacted by colonization. My mob, the language was died out basically and destroyed by colonization, and yeah, there's lots that's been lost from that part of the country and many other parts as well.
So in your journey of, or your, I guess your work with Victoria at Aramkara and in your professional life as a professor of colonization or indigenous studies and decolonization, and in your writings on primal peoples and as a reclamation of life ways and practices, moving away from modernity. What are some of the things that you are involved with at the moment that, particularly in the men's space, that you that's giving you a sense of agency and reconnection to the ancestors that you have that practice ceremony?
Well, certainly connecting with various parts of the men's movement ecosystem. So this is an ecosystem about helping men become better men, basically, and there's a lot going on there, and I'm just connecting in with that and bringing What seems to be welcomed is a focus on understanding indigenous wisdoms and primal ways of knowing, being, doing, relating, perceiving, giving people a sense of that, and also trying to connect men with a kind of understanding of patriarchy that's drawing from colonial knowledges about what what some of the issues we face as men are, and how that long that history is of that, going back to the beginnings of modernity. 10,000 years ago, patriarchy, this huge shift from very gender egalitarian cultures to strong patriarchal cultures is, and the toxic nature of that strong patriarchal culture that emerges in modernity is something that I think is useful to talk about. And part of that, of course, is bringing back ceremony and rites of passage to work. Is something that a number of men are doing already, is that bringing in of ceremony, that bringing in of rites of passage, initiations, drawing on indigenous knowledges and wisdoms to varying degrees, and directly and indirectly. So yeah, it's I've gone on a rites of passage with my son, and I think it's really important work, revitalization work. Such a vital aspect of indigenous cultures is ceremony, ritual, initiations, rites of passage, and something that's very much missing from a lot of people's lives these days.
Yeah, and it's well represented in the way in which uninitiated men rule the world, from the financial industrial complex into the military complex to the pharmaceutical complexes, and the enormous impact and violence that I summarize as fallen patriarchy, recognizing that patriarchy has a place alongside matriarchy and other ways of relating. But the want of or lack of initiation and rites of passage in the masculine sphere, within globalization, within colonial structures and institutions, seems to me the nub of the problem. And I think there's also another problem, is the misunderstanding about what men's business and men's work is in this cultivated gender war, which is another extension of colonialism, to have us all fighting amongst each other in different subgroups. But rightly so, some men's business and reclaiming of safe male spaces has there is misogyny that can appear in those places, even though we've shared ceremony in a number of different men's places, ceremonial men's spaces, and that is not present. There is maybe occasionally a new fella comes to the group and has been hurt and wounded in relationship, and that comes forward as everything is welcome in those spaces. However, the general tone and holding and guidelines and principles and agreements owning our wounds, and rather than projecting and creating a kind of hatred. It's actually the generation of love and connectivity and witnessing men in our griefs, which is the thing you talk about, maturation, the maturing of men, the owning our emotionality, the crafting of skills to express it when there is a hearth secure enough to receive and hear and listen and move beyond intellect and philosophy and politics and judgment. That's a sort of long-winded way of, I guess, expressing to maybe listeners that who either have no idea about what happens in a men's circle or in men's ceremony. But I think the ceremonies we've shared are very much based on that. Yeah, owning our wounds.
Yes, yes. That's the whole point of initiations and rites of passage. And there's many levels or varieties of them, of course, in primal cultures. But all of them really have the point of growing people up. It's a maturing process. And modernity really is antithetical to such things because it's much easier to control people when they are infantilized. So to keep people in a childish rather than childlike, childish and infantilized space in modernity is very much what keeps the oppressive hierarchies working as well as they do. And so the process of maturing, which is a process of taking responsibility for ourselves, the way we show up in the world, our conduct, striving to be in right relationship with each other through integrity, courage, responsibility, compassion. These are dangerous practices for modernity and very nourishing for individual humans, for community, which you need. You need community for rites of passage to work because they have to be held by groups, and people need to have a return as part of it, going out of the familiar, some challenges held by a community, and then a return to a bigger community where those experiences can be processed and metabolized and alchemized. This is the vital aspects of an initiation. So community, maturation, these are antithetical to the sort of modern societies that we live in, and there's ways that they are discouraged, of course, and stopped from happening because of that danger that they represent.
Yeah, it's highly profitable to grow a global culture of narcissists. And yeah, I feel like in many respects, I had growing up the household values, which were universal Christian values that weren't heavy-handed or cult-like. They were just like universal principles, which I'm grateful for. But also then the consumer culture that was back in the 70s and 80s really bringing the tendrils through the my peers, just how that was starting to work in and create, and I felt that very strongly, that the security of the household and neighborhood and friendship. I grew up with many families, not all religious, um, and lots of kids. It was a big tribe of us, lots of gatherings. Um, and then there was pretty much American junk culture with English punk. And I was probably more impressed by English punk than American junk culture, but both were like really getting into my being, and that they represented this sort of departure from this, I guess, household system that I grew in up into, and then that created huge amounts of tension and shame and guilt and arguments with my parents, and that went right into adulthood in my 20s and 30s, and um, when I started reading in my late 30s, early 40s, writers like Martin Prechtel, who were part of this one step in modernity, one step in indigeneity, bringing initiation and rites of passage back into consciousness, and seeing how I was fathering my first son and his teenage chaotic initiation. And so, yeah, it is grief from the lack of ceremony of leaving the bosom of my mother, my first great feminine love, the incredible closeness and yet hatred that was in that relationship, or maybe not hatred, but pushing each other away. There was no consciousness, even the fact that a teenage boy has hormones in his body that actually repel the mother, and vice versa. There is a hormonal chemical shift that is pushing the two away. And when I first heard that, it just made so much sense that to have ceremony around this time of separation with the first great love being the mother, and in order to have good relationships with the feminine other, then that is a critical rites of passage for young boys. And so understanding in middle age the absence of that in my own life, and then becoming very much part of the rites of passage movement up here, and developing, learning, kind of also in this repatching of this work, because we both come from cultures that practice rites of passage. All of our ancestors, like deeper ancestral. It's just you're closer to some of yours, like very close. So I think for me that's the nub, and not just the maturation and the owning of one's wounds, and the owning of grief, and the understanding that grief is a fine teacher and a wild force. But actually the invitation for men, rites of passage, male rites of passage, to say farewell to the son-mother relationship as boy-mum, and say hello through a process to the young man-mother relationship, for both the mother's benefit and the son's benefit, and then the letting go of that entanglement in order for the young man to be fully open to love the feminine other, whether that be the land, whether that be another woman, if they're that way inclined, or just the feminine realm more universally.
Yes, yes. It's an important transition. And as with all of these things, it's very much about what you do with learnings from peak experiences, because the culture that we have is impoverished when it comes to being able to hold the kind of epiphanies and catharsis that can happen at peak events like rites of passage and initiations. It's never going to be as good as it could be, as it was done in primal times before modernity. It's hard. So that's where community comes in, and positive male role models to help to embed some of those changes, in relationships between mothers and sons and so forth. It takes more than it would have before, and we're coming off as well the back of different contexts for relationships. In primal, in indigenous contexts, in primal contexts, the nuclear family wasn't a thing. And so this intensity of relationship between a mother and a son just wasn't there.
Yeah.
Each person had several mothers, several father figures of various sorts, not necessarily biological fathers. And so therefore transitions were easier. Yeah.
And even in the peasant village setup where there was more gender distributed roles before the witch hunts, before the men being exiled from the household and community economies and put down the mines and put into the factories and then came home via the pub with all that violence and demoralization. Before that, as this sort of halfway point between indigeneity and modernity, there were functioning villages that where a son or a daughter, if there wasn't close kinship with mother or father, there was the uncle down the road, the uncle figure, the matrilineal wisdom that could be sought out in the intact village.
Yeah.
And lots of rites. We talked about, the Mayflower and the maypole, the spring rites of young love and winter solstice, and in many ways the new monotheistic religions having to reach back and accept so many of these animist traditions in the religion in order to bring people through. So land bonded and animist connection to place was still very much alive in the ancestral medieval villages of where most of my old people come from.
Yeah, well, they had a lot of rituals and ceremonies, and obviously a kind of connection to land that was different from a kind of hunter-gatherer, but still, its agriculture has a huge impact on that. But still, when people are providing for their own needs in terms of food and medicines and so forth in their local area, that's hugely different to long supply chains that are disconnected from daily lives. So massively better to be living in a medieval village than a modern city.
Yeah. Yeah. I think alienation is one of the biggest killers that people face in urbanized hyper-techno civility, where the city has been the focus. The city is the place to be. Entertainment is provided for, work, and a kind of automated life, where personal accountability has been almost diminished to very little. Well, yeah, for very little, but obviously the the will to relationship is such a human thing that, of course, in cities, people still have that neighborly connection, and there are still people who are forging and trying to renew these what we've had in the past. Um, However, alienation is a massive uh, byproduct of modernity.
Oh yeah,
It,
anonymity
yeah,
and alienation, as you say, leads to just a lack of accountability
yeah,
and responsibility,
yeah,
um,
yeah,
and then reinforcing kind of in a positive feedback loop the transactional nature of life and
yeah, yeah,
this disposability of other life
yeah,
and disposability of relationships. People can just move on,
yeah.
and because everyone is so anonymous,
Mm,
there's no cords of connection to hold that fabric of obligation of which is, the real kind of meaning of the safety net is those deep kinship relationships that hold everybody
mm,
safe
mm,
enough,
mm,
and that actually foster freedom. Freedom and structure are not opposites. You need structure to be free.
yeah.
And this idea, this very Eurocentric colonial idea that comes up all the time is that to be devoid of obligation, to be devoid of responsibility, is freedom.
Mm,
But that's really just alienation,
mm,
loneliness,
yeah.
and defense mechanism to being traumatized by other humans.
Mm,
Understandable. That's
mm,
not freedom.
mm. Yeah, transactional ways of relating are very dominant in this culture of separation. Yeah. I mean, you mentioned before intact cultures of place identify many significant life phases, and rites of passage is not just teenage, but obviously that's a big one. What are some of the key um, phases that you think of in from birth to death, including those two? What are the main points at which rites of passage becomes into focus for
Mm.
for a connected human?
Well, it all sort of blurs together. Life is very ritualized and ceremonial, and so it's going from boy to man is just another important ceremony in life,
Mm,
and there's no real way to sort of differentiate between those. So people, and there's spiritual practices. There's um, kind of preparations and learnings that are required at all stages. Actually, from conception, conception is your
mm,
first kind of rite of passage,
yeah,
and very important in a lot of indigenous cultures, as well as birth. Where you're conceived is
mm,
tells you a lot about your your country, your ceremonial sites that you are custodian, or caretaker for. And yeah, so that's the first birth, of course, and then transition to kind of older childhood can involve rites of passage in some cultures, involving even being, the traditional kind of being taken out and being left in the so-called wilderness, which of course is not how primal children would experience that. But there's some challenge probably that can happen in some cultures at age 8 or 9. Not puberty by any stretch, but it's a transition to a different stage of childhood. Of course, in olden days, not that long ago really, puberty was much later for children. We have a lot of very dangerous chemicals sloshing about these days that cause early puberty. So we're talking like 17.
And cultural stuff too, I think. Like cultural imagery and media is a big part of that too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So going from boy to man, girl to woman would happen at age 17. So it's not like the ages that we're talking about now.
Yeah.
And then of course birth of children is another kind of rite of passage with, like I said, there's all this ceremony involved around it. It's not necessarily that each time you get, it's not like Alone Australia. You don't always get helicoptered out to the remote Tasmanian wilderness, but it's a ceremonial space, of powerful space. And that can be a biological child, or depending on where you're from. If you're a lot of Aboriginal cultures have traditionally have fathering is done by your maternal uncle. So when your sister has a baby, then you become father. Biological fatherhood is not really a thing in a lot of primal cultures. So yeah, then there's deaths of various relatives, which is rites of passage. And of course, on top of all that, there's initiation into different levels of knowledge. So you might be a holder of a number of ceremonies, but you don't start out by running those ceremonies. You have to learn about how they're done properly. So, and in a lot of primal cultures, a lot of knowledge is secret. So it's sacred and it's secret, and you get it to learn more as you go through levels and get your what would be degrees, I guess, in colonial culture. And you're not allowed to just talk about all that with anybody. So you initiate into levels of knowledge holding, which could be several, 6, 7 different levels till you've finished your training in that holding of knowledge. And that's a kind of what we mean by becoming an elder. Like there's no sort of official you're an elder badge, but elders are whom people respect as elders. That's how you become one. But going through those levels of knowledge holding is certainly a kind of eldering.
You mentioned before about in this reclamation of rites of passage and eldership and putting back the ceremonial village as like, well, we'll never get it back. But I wonder whether this moment is just a first tier of reclamation, and that I couldn't, because it feels like a growing awareness and a growing reclamation, women's work, men's work, grief work, rites of passage, eldership work, that where we might be in several generations, time from here might be something very rich, because I've experienced richness even in this first tier. And so that I wonder whether you want to speak to yeah, the holding that generational bond, like how do we become ancestors in reclamation, not necessarily in a period costume way and reclaim, like this is the usual default thing from a narcissistic culture. You want to live back there in those dark days without all your white goods?
Yeah, that's what.
Go for it.
Well,
But
it's interesting because you can't go for it. You're actually precluded from going for it by various laws and bylaws that are in the so-called free societies that we live in. They're very conformist, very constrictive societies, in fact. So when people say, if you don't like it, go somewhere else, it's like, well, tell me where and I'll be there. Where's outside modernity that I can go? So yeah, but we are on what my partner Victoria calls it, on a bridging journey, bridging medicines. It's intergenerational work to bridge from where we are to where we need to go, and it will happen. It's not really a choice. There's got to be some adoption of sustainable life ways. We don't have those now.
Yeah.
And the bridge will be long and intergenerational and will involve most likely medieval level technologies, medieval styles of sociality and community and revillaging will come before, in most cases, before retribing, but we're likely to get to retribing as well. And so it's a lifelong work if you're into trying to reclaim a kind of revitalize ways of being on the earth that are feasible in a long-term sense.
Well, that's the other thing too, the practicalities of this, because the sacred and the material in all intact cultures of place are integrated. And one of the things that I have found and Meg has found in this collaboration together and this revillaging and re-neighborhooding and taking back things that served our ancestors and incorporating some of those things and leaning further into some of those things is the relationship between sacred economy making, that the economy, how we do economy affects how we do culture. And so recognizing that the bigger colonial problems of land privatization that stops so much work. So that capitalism is a much longer project and a much greater societal project than, say, the three capitalisms of food, medicine, and energy resources, where we feel are really possible for households, individuals, small communities to take back, like very immediately big steps, big amounts of ground in that. Of course, that means access to land, and of course, that means the problematic relationship with stolen land, title, and etc. However, sort of like trying to think about, beginning this first tier of reclamation to what I call a ceremonial species approach, which is riffing off Tyson Yunker Porter's custodial species approach, but recognizing that ceremony is actually comes before custodianship. For me personally, that the more we are not beholden to, ensnared by, or subservient to the financial industrial complex, the banker's realm, and all the subordinate capitalisms and corporations that serve that system, and then the governmental tier that then serves those systems, the more we can unchain from those threads in dynamic and practical ways, growing food, catching water, saying hello to our neighbors, sitting in circle, having opportunities during the weeks to sit and listen inside a forest, processes of dissolving into forest, becoming a kind of refragging or a rewiring of a nervous system rewiring by through meditation, through group work, through very simple processes, sitting around a fire like we did last night. And it brings me to that word you brought in bridging, Victoria brought to our last conversation, which I'll post a link to in this, connected to this talk, because that's such a useful word, that bridging, that this is a process. Yeah, I wonder whether, I mean, I know your household has recently got a house cow. This is new learning. This is the gift of the milk that flows from a loved house cow, the soils that are growing your food, some of your food at the moment, the preserving. How are these things feeding into the more sacred aspects of your life at the moment?
Well, it's yeah, we're on the bridge and we're trying to be more, I guess, traditional at this point rather than primal. So traditional would be a more medieval style approach. But it's a process of localizing and becoming one with country, in the sense that there's something important about your actual, because as you said, you know, the primal cultures are about the interweaving of spirit and substance. It's not one or the other. It's not about transcendence or immanence. It's a combination of those in balance. And balance is probably a sort of dynamic, continual balance, like you do when you walk on a tightrope, is what primal cultures are all about. It's not a static balance, it's a dynamic balance, but it's a seeking of that balance. And so having us being made of the country that I'm on is really important. That's what you get from, or we get from trying to relocalize. But yeah, there's obviously a lot that I don't know about how to live the way my ancestors would have lived on country thousands of years ago. I don't know how to do that, but I'm willing to be on a bridge back to that. And that part of that is agriculture, you know, cows, growing food, somewhat horticultural, I guess, like a lot of Aboriginal people did in certain parts of Australia, but certainly not, you know, primal in a deep sense at this point. But those activities of sustenance and subsistence are an opportunity to bring in ceremony and ritual and to be in good relationship with, you know, form a bond with our cow, Ginger, not about treating her transactionally or forcing her to do things, but coming into relationship and trying to, for the gift of milk, trying to do that in a right relationship. And the same, so we, certain ways we talk to her, we sing to her, she likes classical music, this sort of stuff. And also plants, you know, talking to plants, listening to plants, what do they have to say, learning the language of cow. to communicate and bringing, really, it's about bringing reverence and gratitude and awe, really, as well, into life,
Mm.
whilst being practical at the same time.
Mm. It is interesting that we haven't got a cow, but we have sheep and goats, and um, there is a way of operating in this culture where the supermarket is a place to receive meat, um, styrofoam, plastic packaged, lit up, and just to see all this life in that sphere as sort of organized and systemic violence that's not seen as violence. Um, and then the very direct one-on-one taking of a goat's life and the difficulty of that. And that what I've realized is the butcher of the house is that it never gets easier. And that's the point. That there isn't a disconnect for taking the life of a goat that you've tended for, cared for, made sure they've had a herd so that they feel a relative level of safety through their life. They've had good nourishment. They've had scratches and connections. Goats are particularly more than sheep. So human orientated and like very so much closer to dogs than sheep. So that makes it even more difficult to take the life of a goat. So, yeah, so just that I think that those two images that I see as that one-on-one predation as a sort of everyday violence that I take responsibility for. And then the shelf of fluoro lit or seductively lit meat in the supermarket as the schism, as the kind of image schism between the world I was born into and walking away from, and the world that I'm leaning deeper and deeper into as this first tier of trajectory from modernity, the modernity I was born into.
Yes, yes.
I wonder whether we could just finish with a where to now for both of us. Like we're on the bridge. We're involved in different men's groups and rites of passage. We're both fathers. I'm a father to sons, you're a father to sons and daughters. Yeah, like what's just come into view for you on that bridge?
Well, yeah, me and my partner Victoria are trying to, as I said, localize, and part of that is grow an intentional community at Anankara Homestead. And so we are on that bridge of, yeah, what happens when you change the model from nuclear family to a more extended sense of family that comes through cords of connection, through kinship grown within more communal settings. That's where we're at. That's what we're trying to do, and that feeds in to the spiritual. The ceremonial feeds into the substance, the practical, the food productions, and so forth of life. All of those things.
And excitingly, you've got young people stepping into that space, but also elders stepping into that space. That from what it sounds like, there's
Yeah.
as it's growing. That's
Yeah, it seems like we might be poised for at a point of growth for the community. These things are not linear. We've been going for a couple of years, very modest growth, but there might be a spurt of growth now, and to hold that as custodians of that homestead is our challenge. And as you said, life is not meant to be easy. It's not meant to be unrelenting oppression and immiseration either, but it's not meant to be comfortable and easy. It's meant to be intense and passionate and alive and held in that through the structure that ceremony, ritual and spirituality provides to people. I think that is our birthright, RITE, birthright. And it's something that we miss out at our peril. So at Anamkara, we're very keen on. The pillars, the 4 pillars of community for us are work together, play together, eat together, and pray together. Pray we take broadly to mean spirituality.
Yeah. Beautiful. Yeah. And the bridge that I'm on here with my household and community is looking at a calendar wheel of all the different rites of the year. So we started with a fatherhood and motherhood circle of new parents to be several years ago. And from that, being with the children every Monday in the forest, and now looking to run our first rites of passage with those kids who've been coming since they were very young. And now we have a cohort of teenagers. That feels good. Women's and men's, listening to country vigils. The men and women who sit together are now going out into country for 3-day, 3-night fasts, water fasts. And then the summer solstice and winter solstice and how that fits in. And then at the equinox points of the year, different men's and women's medicine days. And so we're in the sort of early stages of all this little sort of incremental step-by-step reclamation over probably 10 years. There's now like this sort of draft calendar that's come. And it hasn't come through like us forcing it. It's like arrived in its own time and watchfulness. And yeah, I think for me, Mother Country, and that's a term that other Indigenous friends use affectionately for country, and I get that because I feel the feminine presence of Grandmother Gaia and all the different mother countries, Earth Mother, Earth Goddess, Goddess Mother cosmologies that we all come from. Yeah, but also I think this process for me has been a move away from the shame and guilt I felt as a settler white male into reclaiming a compassion for myself as a man, compassion for men, love for men, and yeah, revillaging in a way where men and women are not at war, but actually supporting each other to do the medicine, to do the growth. That feels really very special. And I know that that's the work you're doing a few hours yonder from here. And I guess the point of this yarn, this public yarn, is expressing and sharing, not necessarily in fine detail, because we've had that more personal time together, to discuss the details and the intimacies of that, but more the sort of the broader arching place of the bridge.
Yes, yes. We're both on the bridge together and apart by some portion of the bridge in terms of places, times, the geography of separation, but together as well. And yeah, it's a worthwhile journey. It's a necessary journey, and a journey that we'll all be called to as empire crumbles, as modernity is hospice, and yeah, feels like worthwhile work for the hands and the heart and the head
Mm.
and the gut.
Yeah. Thanks, Yin. Good to chat. Good to yarn.
Thanks, Patrick.
Good to share food.
Share ceremony.
Mm.